Welcome to another episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. I'm attorney Thomas Ozbolt with Shane Smith Law, and we're talking today with Dr. Darcy Dane with Carolina Brain Center.
I'm a chiropractic neurologist, and I own Carolina Brain Center in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our primary focus is treating people with TBIs, MTBIs, or concussion, and also human optimization for athletes. So it's a super fun practice. We get to change a lot of lives, which is great. It's figuring out what part of the brain is not working so great. So is it a cerebellar issue? Is it brainstem? Is it, it could be a bunch of different things. And so the diagnosis of concussion or MTBI, that's kind of the easy part. And somebody can come in and just tell you their symptomatology and kind of the mechanism of injury, and okay, great, you had a concussion. But then what does that entail for treatment? So from a medical doctor's perspective, they'll tell you probably just, rest and, you'll be better in a month or, it'll go away on its own. But the fact is, while a lot of concussions are self-limiting, there's a boatload of people where it's not self-limiting. And once you start getting into, 4 to 6 weeks of symptomatology that's not going away, or it's getting worse, or hey, I was better for the first 2 weeks and then all of a sudden the symptoms started coming back, then what do you do, right? You go back to the neurologist, they're like, well, you had a concussion, so just rest, it'll get better on its own. But we run a bunch of diagnostic tests in our practice that show, hey, look, there is an actual issue in the ocular motor system or in your vestibular system or in the way that those two are working together. And as a human being with 2 eyes and 2 feet, you're a navigator, right? So those two systems are constantly running and they have to be synced up together. And so that's why it doesn't get better on its own, because if one is kind of off, then it starts affecting how the other is working. So we've gained the knowledge and the tools to be able to start treating specifically in detail and in great detail how to get these systems back online. So what we're talking about is creating a positive neuroplastic change. And neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to make new synaptic connections. So if we have an injury in an area of the brain, then we want to make those new synaptic connections, because you could loosely say, like, the wires became a little frayed. And so what we want to do is go in and, re-strengthen the connection and rewire the way that the brain is working.
Let me ask you this. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no,
back up. You talked about pathways, like if just for everybody, like what did you mean by pathways when you're talking about, learning how the pathways work? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So when we're looking at like the ocular motor system, like eyes are a huge window into brain function. So every different eye movement that we make has a different pathway through the brain. So if we are talking about like a fast eye movement to a novel target, so something pops up into your periphery and you look over at it real quick, that's going to be what's called a novel saccade. Saccades are just fast eye movements from one target to another. And that's going to be initiated in the frontal brain. If we have a remembered saccade, then it's different. It doesn't get generated from the frontal brain. It gets generated in a different part of the brain. Now, both those ocular motor movements are going to have the same areas as far as like in the brainstem area. So, and then we have things like smooth pursuit. So like tracking, if you're, watching a plane go by, or you're, a duck hunter or something like that. And those are more like parietal brain lobe. So when we're looking at, hey, there's breakdown in, when somebody's pursuing to the left, it's choppy instead of smooth. It could be a parietal lesion. It could be something in the brainstem. So it's none of the tests that we do are going to be we can tell you exactly what the problem is with this one test. We have to look at a whole conglomerate of testing to be able to really pinpoint, hey, this is where the issue is, so this is what we need to work on. Now, there's common areas that get affected with, any kind of acceleration, deceleration, whiplash, or concussion type, trauma. And largely you're looking at, things like frontal brain, looking at things in the brain stem itself. And brain stem, we have, that there's huge connections into the cerebellum, which is motor, timing, coordination, balance. There's huge connections into the vestibular system, which is, again, like balance. So all your inner ear stuff. So, people get hit more from the side, you're more likely to have vestibular symptomatology, right? So when we're talking pathways, it's just important to get, very specific into, what actually needs to be rehabilitated, because we can use parts of the brain that are working well to then start rehabbing things that are not working so well. And then at the same time, you have to understand that you can't ever tickle one part of the brain. So, your knowledge base also, and experience and things like that, and I've been doing this for a long time, is you have to know, like, okay, if I want to kind of tickle this part of the brain, I know it's going to have a global effect. So do I want to, is this so damaged that I don't really want to make that like where I throw the stone in, right? If we're thinking of like the ripple effect, right? Maybe I want to throw the stone here so that we can, have a less strong effect on that area while we're trying to rehab it. It's simple, and at the same time, it's like super complex. And there's no cookie cutter way to treat any one concussion. You could line up 20 concussion people and maybe they all have the same symptomatology, but once you do the diagnostic testing, you figure out what the actual issue is, and when you start treating the person, that in itself is hugely diagnostic, and you have to be able to nimbly change courses to be able to treat that person as an individual, their injury as, something that's completely different from maybe the next guy that walks in. So
a lot of what we see with traditional neurologists is they kind of have the same sort of protocol for everyone. Like you said, hey, go home, rest, maybe here's some migraine medication or something like that. Sounds like what you're saying is you're assessing people individually, and with that ripple effect, it's almost like you toss that pebble in the lake over here so that you're not stimulating or affecting that area that might be damaged as much. You're almost trying to make it all work together in a way that's different than what we see traditionally.
Right. And that's super important, is everything has to work together, right? Because your brain it's doing a bazillion things at once. And, and again, because of that ripple effect, you have to take the whole system into consideration when you're doing the treatment. So, and you're right, that's one of the biggest differences, is just, it's everything is very individualized versus, great, you have a concussion, go rest, here's some medication, and good luck, right? And for some people, it's going to work. I mean, and then for other people, it just doesn't. And other factors that, and even there was a research article I read not too long ago that, everybody is ignoring the neurometabolic cascade of concussion. And that's huge. And we've, a little bit focused on that for a long time. And so I think, that's why our outcomes are as good as they are. And that happens like right at the point of impact. So you get this huge increase in glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. That's going to start affecting, like your adrenaline system. People get light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, they're irritable. So when we have a big, influx of glutamate, then we have potassium pouring out of cells. So each axon has a cell body. We have the sodium potassium pumps. So if you go way back into middle school and you learned about like the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell and how we produce ATP and all this kind of stuff. So there was a huge research paper written on the neurometabolic cascade of concussion. It explains it like beautiful. It's like one of my favorite papers, right? I'm actually going to be teaching on it in October. But when we have that potassium coming out, well, then we've got to get that ionic system back working again, right? So now we need more glucose to be able to run the sodium potassium pump. And that is how we're going to create ATP as well. It takes energy to do that. And when we have high things of glutamate, we don't it's harder to get glucose into the cell. So we create this huge energy crisis. So this is all a part of this, neurometabolic cascade of concussion that should shut down in, like 2 weeks. So that's like why the doctors are like, oh, you'll be fine. It'll be self-limiting in, 2 to 3 weeks. And sometimes it just doesn't shut down very well. So people continue to have the light sensitivity and the noise sensitivity and mood changes and all this kind of stuff. Migraine headaches, all that. And so we have a couple things that we do specifically for calming that system down and then kind of getting your mitochondrial system healthy again. It's super important, because if that system doesn't shut down properly, or that system, but that metabolic cascade, then you're gonna have a harder time rehabbing anything else, because you've got the energy crisis. Things, the axons are not, they stop communicating as well. You can have, a lot of breakdown between the transmission between axons, and that's how communication happens in the brain. So it's a largely ignored part of either whiplash or TBI concussion. And like I said, there was a research paper that said, hey, everybody, there's this, great information out there. Why is nobody doing anything about it? And I was like, wait, we are, so, yeah. And it's a huge game changer. So we, use things like hyperbaric therapy and ketone therapy and things like that to be able to improve that portion. And, typically people start feeling a little calmer, sleeping a little bit better, a little more energy, stamina, things like that. So sometimes, depending on how severe or significant, symptomatology and the injury is, we may just start with that, period, and that's it. Before we start getting into trying to rehab a brain that's failing metabolically anyway. So that's another thing, right? Is, knowing when to treat and when not to treat. And, we'll have people in the area that, maybe working a little bit outside their lane and they don't understand that, right? And so then all of a sudden people are like, well, I went and I did vestibular therapy and I just felt terrible afterward. I was nauseous and sick, and I finally just quit going because it just made me feel so bad. No, you clearly just weren't, you weren't ready for that much work yet. It may not be that we may not get, that we'll get there at some point, but you can, sometimes you can't start there, right? So it's just the other, I guess, again, just kind of going back to the difference between your traditional medical field versus, the chiropractic neurology is really knowing, when to treat, when not to treat, where to start treatment, and, how to build for each individual person. So
one of the things I've always appreciated about you and the way you do things is that it seems like you're dedicated to learning and advancing, your continuing medical education as this goes on. And you don't always see that same curiosity in lawyers in terms of their continuing legal education, right. But the same thing applies to doctors. But one of the things I thought I really, should have asked this kind of earlier on, you say you've been doing this for a long time in terms of dealing with the neurometabolic cascade, and, you've been doing things to work on this, and you're talking about some different testing that you don't see a lot of different places. So How long have you been doing this? How long has your practice been around, or how did you get to where you are today?
Right. So, like I said, first I'm a chiropractor. And so I graduated in 99, and did, just some regular chiropractic stuff. Like most people, you get out of school, you take whatever job, is available, and, worked in some different, places that specialized in, accident injuries and things like that. Got very proficient, with my chiropractic skills and, and that kind of thing. And then, started up a business with a friend from school, and it failed spectacularly, which of course, you learn so much more from that than anything else. And, you start fine tuning, okay, well, this is how I'm going to do it next time. And then I ended up moving to North Carolina in 2006 to pursue a Master of Divinity, just for my own thing. So that's what brought me to the Raleigh area. And then I opened up a practice in 2008. I just wasn't sure if I was going to stay here afterward, right? So I had taken some time out of practice to do that. And then I just, it honestly started with kids. It was everybody's got ADD. Autism was on the rise. What can you do? I hear chiropractors can cure. And I'm like, chiropractors cannot cure this. I don't know who's telling you this, but this is not how it works, right? Remembered, oh yeah, there's that whole chiropractic neurology thing, and they were starting up a kid-specific kind of avenue. So I went and sat in on a class, and that was it. I was just hooked, and I was like, this is what I want to do. Started doing all the coursework to become a chiropractic neurologist, took the boards, passed them the first time, thank God, because that was 4 days of just complete double hockey sticks, right? So, it was terrible. But anyway, and then they had started up a whole TBI program. And so that took 2 years. Every other month, we would meet in Atlanta for 3 days and basically pour through a book called The Neurology of Eye Movements and start putting very dry read. So after that, and just implementing all that stuff as I was going. And I'm on, at that time, I was on faculty for the Carrick Institute, which does most of the training for the chiropractic neurology. And so I was traveling quite a bit and teaching some of the basic classes. And then practice got busy, too busy to be traveling, and had 2 dogs at home and therapy dogs at the office. It was just kind of, so I still do a little bit of teaching. Like I'll be, part of the synaptic symposium and things like that. I have to study harder than a lot of people. I think sometimes, you got those people that can just like read something and they can, throw it off. And I really have to dig in to understand stuff, but I'm really good at applying information. And so I think that is, one thing that I'm like super grateful for, is that for whatever reason, God's gifted me with the ability to practically apply information. And it's fun because it really makes sure, you're having to like think. And, how do I, and I'm a studier. So, I'm constantly reading papers and things like that. So really since 2008, I've been, solely doing kind of the neurology thing. And I got boarded in 2011. So that's when I was official. So, and then we have to keep up with a lot of continuing education, even above and beyond what you have to do to maintain your chiropractic license in North Carolina. So it's pretty extensive.
So you talked about a few times when we were, backing up a little bit in terms of, you mentioned kind of like a car accident or a car crash. That's a lot of what we would deal with here at Shane Smith Law. And I was interested when you talked about, an impact from the side versus an impact from the front. In terms of answering questions for the people who are watching and just, educating people out there, is when you have whiplash, like we just talked about whiplash specifically, the motion that you get when you're hit from behind or from in front in terms of backwards whiplash. But if you're hit from behind and your body takes that, tremendous kind of torque, can that cause traumatic brain injury, mild traumatic brain injury, concussions?
Yeah, so the research is out there that really whiplash and concussions, the symptomatology is going to be pretty much the same. And if you really dig a little bit deeper, you've got a soft brain inside a hard shell. So even if you don't hit your head on the steering wheel or on the side mirror, or, whatever, you're still having an impact, right? And even, in addition to the actual impact, you've got the axonal stretching in brainstem areas. So your brain is basically held up. It's called the tentorium. It's kind of like a little hammock, and there's a shearing action that can happen, and that affects some of those brainstem areas that we're talking about. It'll affect ocular, motor, vestibular, and things like that. And then on top of it, you've got the soft brain hitting the hard shell, right? So you can have, injury in those areas as well. And it's usually, it's almost always a double impact, right? Because you're forward, then you're going to go back. What's in back of you? Now you've got the headrest, you hit that, and maybe you even go forward again and then back again, right? So, how many impacts is it? Like we had a kid that we were working with the other day that, she's been everywhere. She had some previous concussions, which of course didn't help matters. Age didn't help matters, but she was assaulted at school and was basically hit in the head 17 times. And the mom's like, well, she had a concussion. I said, Yeah, well, how many concussions did she have that day? I mean, was it one or was it 17? So, it's important to understand that, there with the different, mechanisms of injury, you can have multiple impacts with one event. And
Right.
so then you've got, a lot more you have to deal with, quite possibly. And then, again, predisposing factors are huge. So, research is very clear. Developing brains are not going to do as well with concussion, and you're going to have longer effects and possibly permanent effects. And that's just it, right? So, kids with learning disabilities, their recovery is way worse with concussion. And adults with, mood disorders or their own learning disability, even from you're going to have worse recovery. You got somebody with autoimmunity, like maybe they, female has Hashimoto's thyroiditis. She's going to have worse recovery. And that goes back to the neurometabolic cascade of concussion because they're already in an inflamed state anyway, right? So, so that's where you've even got to bring in okay, I've got to look at your past stuff and say, all right, you already have autoimmunity, MS, Hashimoto's, whatever it is. And so we really need to work on this neurometabolic cascade of concussion. And then we can start working on the rest of the stuff.
Well, we have a lot to talk about with Dr. Dane. Come back for the next part of our conversation with her. Remember to like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. And remember, if you're in pain, call Shane, 980-999-9999.
In pain, so I call Shane, 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.